Because, of course, those are excused absences for celebrations of knowledge if you're not feeling well. But if you are feeling well, just like all the faculty, I expect y'all to be here as well. So just let me know before class if you're not feeling well, and then, of course, I can excuse that absence. So, all right. So, onward. So we're into chapter 4 now. This is community ecology. And we're in hurricane season now, as you know, and it's been a strong hurricane season. This has been the case the last several years. And Tropical Storm Sally is the latest after Hurricane Laura has moved on by. And of course, these cause all kinds of damage to our human infrastructure, human-built infrastructure. But it's interesting to think about, what do these kinds of disturbances mean for our ecological communities as well? Because as we discussed, right, ultimately, all the things that we use in this planet are derived from our ecosystems. And so we might ask the question, how do these sorts of events affect ecosystems? And then how do the ecosystems recover? And so we're going to start with that topic a little bit today. And so Hurricane Katrina was in 2005, and this is a picture of some of these barrier islands off the coast of Louisiana, what they looked like before Katrina and then after. And so it was a very different ecosystem, right? You see we had sort of these beaches, sand, lots of vegetation, a productive island, whereas that was all kind of washed away and covered in mud and these things. So it's important to remember, as a lot of you discussed in your response when I asked about the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, it's important to remember that disturbances can be good for ecosystems as well, right? They can allow species to maintain their standing in an ecosystem instead of being outcompeted. So we have to view these kinds of disturbances within that context and how communities respond. So one way that we can think about that is about which species are able to do well and which ones aren't. And so I wanted to discuss just a little bit these population growth curves. And so if we imagine the life cycle of a species, right, from the time that it's born until the time that it dies, let's look at that population and say, what proportion of that population is surviving from young to older? And so we could have a couple of different things going on. So one of the things that could happen is what's shown here with this type 3 curve. What's happening with this dark blue curve here? How might we characterize the life cycle of that species from this curve? Any thoughts? Good. Experiencing really high mortality at a young age, right? So the number of survivors drops really rapidly. And then it's more stable, right? So one thing we can see are what we call type 3 curve species. So these are species that lose a lot of individuals very early on in their life. But then once you survive to a certain age, you're doing pretty well. And so we think about what characterizes these species. They generally have lots of offspring, but they don't invest a lot of energy into raising that offspring. What might that look like? Any ideas of like an animal species that looks that way? Mm-hmm. Turtles, yeah, the images of the sea turtles, right, where you've got all those young that are born, and then they've got to find their way to the beach or to the ocean, right, and you've got all these things that are trying to eat them. Yeah, it's kind of sad, right? You've got like the birds and you've got but one way of thinking, like some of those are going to survive, and once they get to the ocean, they're in pretty good shape. So that's a good example that people are probably pretty familiar with. Any other examples? Frogs, yeah, most frogs will have like, they'll lay lots and lots of eggs. Like if you go in by any ponds in the winter, you might see these kind of gelatinous masses in the water, and they lay all these eggs, thousands of eggs. But then similar to the turtles, the parents are not going to be expending much energy watching over those. In fact, none. And so a lot of those are going to be eaten. It's going to be hard for them to survive, right? So we see species like this, where they have lots and lots of offspring, but then a lot of those die early on. So the idea is then, evolutionarily speaking, some of them survive to get older, to mature and reproduce. These are some data on species of fish. You know me, it's always about the fish. And so, they similarly lay a lot of eggs, and then really high mortality until they get to a little bit higher age. You don't need to know this species, it's just an example of this. We can have species kind of intermediate to that, right? So these are species that, have mortality distributed over the entire lifespan, like it's a pretty much constant slope there as far as loss of number of individuals. And so these are going to have fewer offspring, a little more parental energy, but kind of not to the extreme. So, birds, and we probably think of birds as like a species that gives lots of energy to lots of care and attention to their young, right? Because they lay eggs, put them in a nest. But in the grand scheme of things, compared to some other species, that's maybe not as much time as others would spend. So type 2 is kind of intermediate here. And then, you know what? Sorry, something is weird. I don't have a separate thing for type 3, did I? Or type 1. That's weird. Sorry. Well, let's just imagine for a moment then. Let's talk about our type 1 species. These are going to have relatively fewer young. Why are they going to have fewer young with our type 1 species? Yeah, so our type 1 species are going to be putting a lot of energy and investment into each offspring. So it's basically the opposite of type 3, okay? So I apologize, I don't know how I missed that. But so type 1 have fewer offspring, and they're putting a lot of energy into raising each one of those particular offspring. Can we think of an example of some species in this category? Yeah, humans, right? We have a 9-month gestational period, and then after that, right, some folks, right, typically stay at home at least till they're 18 years old, right? So that's a long time. And it's always complicated with humans because, we have behavioral learned things as well, right? And so can we think of a non-human example? Yeah, whales as well, right? Whales have a very long gestational period. It can be, does anyone know? I don't know that offhand, how long it takes for the baby to develop inside the mother whale. I'm guessing it's over a year because generally the larger the species, the longer the gestational period is. Like with elephants, it's over a year. And then, the mother, and again, a whale is a mammal, right, which is crazy, right? It's a mammal that swims around the ocean. So it nurses its young. So the young don't even have to find their food for quite a while, right? So I'm unprepared to say the exact amount of time.
Depends on the whale.
Depends on the whale. Good answer.
Between 10 and 18 months.
10, 18 months for the gestational period? Wow, yeah, that's like twice as long. So that's a ton of time, right? So clearly, not able to apportion it to lots of young, so fewer young. Yeah, thank you. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. Orcas, also known as killer whales. They like that name because it kind of makes them sound tough and stuff, but really, like, they're whales, They're nice once you get to know them. They look kind of ferocious, though, with those big white eyes and stuff. Those aren't their eyes, but anyway. Yes?
Would, canines be considered a type 1 species?
Yeah, so how many young do dogs typically have? Probably varies. Yeah, a lot less than frogs and sea turtles. So they would be more to this type 1 scale than a type 2. So yeah, so in general, mammals are over here, in general, the larger ones, except for some medium-sized ones. Anyway, all right, so why are we interested in this? So you might have heard these terms K-selected versus R-selected before. So if we think back to our population growth curves from back before the exam, and we thought of that logistic growth curve or the S-shaped growth curve, as several of you all pointed out, the population growth slows as it approaches the carrying capacity, right? So at the carrying capacity, you've got lots of individuals in the population. So when there's lots of individuals in the population, what can we say about the amount of competition going on? See a couple of people point, yeah, it's going to be higher, right? So the higher the population, the more the competition is going on. Now on the other hand, again, as several of you all said on the exam, when exponential growth occurs, we're not limited by resources. And so in those cases, the only thing that limits our growth is our per capita, our per capita growth rate. So if you think of type 1 versus type 3 species, if there are plenty of resources to go around, which type of species is going to grow their population fastest? If there's lots and lots of resources to go around. So the type 3s will. Yeah, because they're the ones that have the most young. Now, they don't give a lot of attention to those young, which is bad if the young have to compete for resources and it's a harsh environment. But if conditions are good and there's plenty of resources to go around, those type 3 species, because they have lots of young, they're going to be able to increase their population really rapidly. Whereas the type 1 species, and I realize this is circled, but so whereas these type 1 species, they might have everything they need to survive in the environment, no limits at all. But if it's the whale, it's still going to take over a year to produce young, right? So their population is going to have to grow more slowly. Okay, so because of that, and then the flip side is which are the strongest competitors. So we kind of nailed that already. But so we sometimes talk about type 1 curve species as being K-selected, because when the population is near the carrying capacity, those that have fewer young but take care of their young until they're much older are going to ensure survival, right? So, you know, by the time the mammal leaves its mother, it's a fully formed, strong individual able to compete for resources. On the other hand, those baby turtles are going to be in a tougher place. And maybe that's not the greatest example, but if we look at the frogs and the tiny eggs, right, they're going to be very vulnerable, and when they first hatch out, are going to have a hard time acquiring resources. Okay, so K-selected, when we're near our carrying capacity, type 1 curve species. Fewer young, but lots of parental care, they do well. On the flip side, when there are lots and lots of resources to go around, and we can experience exponential growth, well, that's when the type 3 curve species are going to take over, because they're going to be able to grow their populations faster. And they're going to be able to outnumber those type 1 curve species pretty fast. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? All right, cool. So let's take that idea and look at how a community would develop over time after a disturbance. So we've studied these in all sorts of different contexts, but one of them is as glaciers have been receding, right? And so does anybody know when the last glacial maximum was, the last time sheets of ice advanced as far down as they did under the continent, like North America? Yeah, in the ballpark about 15,000 years ago. So there were these mile-thick sheets of ice that came down all the way to Kentucky, essentially. And so they've been receding ever since. And so as these glaciers have been receding, they leave bare ground behind them that nothing was living on, of course, because it was frozen. And then so we get to see how the communities developed in those places over time. So what kind of species do you think are likely to arrive in these new communities first? Do you think they're type 1 or type 3? So is there a question? Yeah, probably type 3, because they've got more young, they grow populations faster, they can get to areas more quickly just because their populations grow. And an example of those are what are called lichens. So lichens are a symbiosis, two species living closely together, between a fungus and a bacteria. And yeah, I'm sure you all have seen these, right? They're these, they're kind of like crusts on rocks, and they disperse very easily. They're blown on the wind, and all they need is a rock. So a lichen is a good example of the kind of species, and our selected species that would get there first. And that we have a term we use for these called pioneer species. So the very first species that arrive at a place after disturbance are called pioneer species. And most of these, as you would expect, are these type 3 R-selected species. And what's neat is that these lichens, it turns out, play a big role in forming the soil, because there's not any soil underneath these glaciers, right? It's just rock. But these lichens break down the rocks, and then as they die and decompose, they contribute organic matter, and so these lichens help contribute to the formation of soil. So we have a term for the predictable series of changes in a community following a disturbance. That term is succession. And the idea is that you can, in some cases, predict pretty well like which species are going to come to habitats after a disturbance. So that could be a disturbance like being covered in ice for thousands of years, or it could be a disturbance like the hurricane that comes through, right? Whatever it is. And I think someone asked the other day, how do we define disturbance? And the best way to define disturbance ecologically is it's just an event that kills a lot of individuals. So it kind of resets the population. So succession then is this predictable series of changes in a community following a disturbance. Now we can have primary or secondary succession. Anybody know what the difference is between those two?
Is one of them like starting from complete scratch, and the other one like if the disturbance is interacting everything?
Right, exactly. So primary succession is starting from scratch with no species at all. So everything's been eliminated for whatever reason. And then secondary succession is coming back after a disturbance that has killed a lot of individuals, but there are still species left there. So, so after a hurricane, there'd be an example of secondary succession. Not everything was wiped out. Okay. Can anybody think of some other examples of succession? A volcanic eruption, right. So that'll set the ecosystem back again. Mount St. Helens back in the 80s, and that blew up. That set the whole forest back.
Forest fire?
Forest fire, Say that again?
Landslides?
Landslides, Lava? Oh, tsunami, So I study rivers and streams. What might cause succession to happen again in a river or a stream? Yeah, so a flood could. Also something that like takes out all the water and creates a drought. When I first came to UNCA in 2008, the French Broad River was so low that you could walk across it in some sections. We're in the midst of a crazy drought, right? So a lot of the small streams dried up. So then all the species had to get back into those areas again. So yeah, sand dunes, if you've ever been to the beach, you think about like, wow, what a dynamic, ever-changing ecosystem. And so you have seeds of grasses that will get to these first, and they'll start growing, and that will stabilize the dune. And so then we'll have a little bit of soil formation, and eventually other plants will get there. So dune formation is an example. A drought in a stream, again, is an example of a disturbance that will lead to succession. And we have certain species in rivers and streams that get there fast and are able to reset these. Forest fires were mentioned as well, right? And it's interesting, especially out west where there are these crazy fires right now, there are tree species that need fire to disperse their seeds. There are certain pine species that the pine cones have to get really hot and kind of pop, and the seeds are released. So a disturbance for one species is kind of like a blessing for the other because they can't survive without it. So we always want to think evolutionarily about these different points of crisis and how they might lead to evolution to deal with it, right? But yeah, so forest fires as well. All right, so if we think of how communities develop over time, this idea of succession, thinking just on the plant side of things, initially we'll get some small plant species, things that have tiny seeds that are dispersed on the wind, right? So these are like your R-selected plants. If you think of seeds as a plant's offspring, these grasses have got tiny seeds that are blown on the wind. So lots and lots of offspring, not much parental care. What might parental care look like for a plant? How would a plant parent care for its young? What might that look like? How might the size of the seed play a role? You think a large seed is going to have more resources or a small seed? Large seed, right? So when you think of plants and trees that have really large seeds, that's like more investment by the parent and the offspring, if you will. Yeah. So anyway, so we have these tiny seed grasses that are getting here first. Then over time, new species arrive. Now, why do these species take over these species? Why don't these species just dominate for centuries?
There's like a compete for the canopy. Like those species could grow taller, maybe they have better defense mechanisms like thorns or maybe some kind of poisonous material that keeps predators away.
Mm-hmm. So remember, these ones that get here first are type 3 species. They're great dispersers, but they're not good competitors usually, right? And what is the dominant resource going to be that they're competing for here? Sun. So it could be other things too, like water, depending on the area. But across the globe, everywhere, plants need light. So it's no coincidence that the height of this canopy gets taller and taller and taller as time goes on, because those individuals are getting better and better and better and better at competing for light. And so, given decades, and in some cases centuries, eventually our community becomes dominated by hardwoods that have large seeds, if you've seen like acorns, right, those kinds of things, that have large seeds. And when they're growing up there, there's no light that reaches the bottom of that forest floor for these things to live anymore. So they're only going to survive if they can get to some new place that's opened up, maybe by a hurricane, maybe by a tornado, maybe by trees that were cut down by the Forest Service, maybe by trees that fell down because they were hit with disease. Whatever it was, these species now have to get to another area. So the climax community is a term we use to describe the end result of succession. So the strongest competitors are there, and all of those type 3 R-selected species, if they're able to survive at all, have to survive in kind of patches of that area where the sun hits the bottom. Any questions on that? What might be, oh yeah.
How is
That's a really good question. I mean, essentially, as trees grow and grow and grow, they become better and better and better competitors. So it's really when the largest trees dominate. So around here we have like oak hickory forests. So the species of trees depend on like moisture, nutrients, all this kind of thing. But it's just when the largest hardwoods dominate. So yeah, you'd have to talk to a plant ecologist who could say, all right, here we've got some young tulip poplars that in a few decades might dominate, but now they're not really. We've got some pine trees overhead. So you really kind of have to know the area. But the bottom line is it all depends ultimately on like the size of the tree, because that's the main axis of competition that you have to think about. But yeah, take ecology and field biology, and you'll see some neat examples of like in 100 years, these trees are going to dominate everything else. But right now, like, they haven't gotten there yet, It's crazy, man. Trees can live for thousands of years, some of them. That just blows my mind. Yeah.
Does whatever type of trees dominate in the canopy, like let's say, like in this example, it was pine, but then it became hardwood. Does it switch off between softwoods and hardwoods?
You mean like back and forth?
Yeah.
So generally, you end up with the hardwoods in most forests, okay? But y'all that have ever been out to the parkway and hiking like that, what kind of areas do you find the most pines in? High elevation. So so there are some areas that hardwoods are not really going to be able to get established. And so in that case, our succession is going to come to a halt somewhere in here. So, yeah. So it's an interesting question. So like, what are the things that can halt this process? So one of them, elevation, right? So temperature, things like that. These species can all live there. Anybody ever been, so there's a place called Graveyard Fields. Anybody ever hiked there? A few folks? Oh, awesome. So you might have read that little plaque, storyboard kind of thing there up at the head of the trail. People go to Graveyard Fields. I didn't get to go this year. But you can go there in August, and there's lots of blueberries to pick. Blueberries are early successional shrubs, but they've been there for a really, really, really long time. Anybody remember maybe you didn't read it, maybe you just wanted to hike, which is usually what I do, but there was something that happened at Graveyard Fields that has sort of stalled this successional process. There was a really intense fire there. And the fire was so intense that it burned the soil and it burned the nutrients in the soil. So there's not enough nutrients for succession to keep going. And the soil is shallow too. There's a lot of bedrock there. It's right near the middle prong stream there. So other processes can kind of halt this, or other factors can kind of halt these processes, this process of succession. But if there's enough of everything there, eventually it's going to get to this point. And we talk about succession the most with plants just because it's clearest. It's easiest to see. Like in animal communities, you've got species moving back and forth. I mean, it happens in all communities, but plants, because they get there and they stay there, it's easiest to see, I think. Yeah, interesting question. So it's kind of neat when you're hiking in the woods or anywhere else and just think like, what type of successional community am I in? Like how much light is coming in? How big are these trees? Those are the things I think about anyway. Anybody been to Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest and hiked there? Okay, cool. So this is one of the only patches of old growth forest. You guys familiar with the term old growth forest? It just means it's never been logged. So ideally succession would go kind of to its endpoint. And so it's famous for these really old and huge tulip poplar trees, like 300, 400, 500-year-old tulip poplar trees. So when I first heard that there's this area, oh, it's going to be like so dense, it's going to be like the tropical rainforest. Like I won't be able to walk through this thing without like bumping into trees and stuff. But what's interesting is that relatively speaking, and this picture doesn't do a great job of showing it, the bottom of the forest floor was a lot more sparse than I would have thought. And it was just because you got these huge trees, like have lots of shrubs and stuff. on the forest floor, as you would if there was more light coming in. So it's kind of like old growth forests. It's actually not super dense, because the only ones that can hang out there are. All right. So community ecology is the study of the interactions among species. So what are the different ways that species can interact then when they come together? What sorts of things can happen? What's that? Oh, so yeah, so the food chain, you can have predation happening. Yeah, you can have them eating each other. Got parasites, This is good. What's that? Symbiosis, Yeah, so there's a few different ways this can go down. So symbiosis is kind of a broad catch-all term, which just means Sim means together. Bios is life, so like living closely together is symbiosis. Then the other two ways, well, I suppose nothing could happen is the other thing that can happen. But as far as important interactions to our community goes, predation and then competition are the other ones. And we'll talk about each of these separately. So first of all, symbiosis, right? So this is a close relationship between two species. What are the different kinds of symbioses that we can have? We heard one already. It was parasitism. Everybody know the other two? Yep, mutualism, good. And the other one which has the fewest examples, and it's kind of hard to think about sometimes. Yeah, so commensalism, and sorry, you can't see this. This says mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. And so you don't need to write these all down. We'll talk about them each separately. So which one is it when both species benefit? Yeah, so this is a mutualism. So when we have a mutualism, this is a symbiosis where both species benefit. What are some examples of this?
Those birds that eat the gunk out of the alligator's teeth.
Yeah, bless those birds, right? Yeah, no. So, right, so we have lots of species that eat parasites, right? So like birds that eat parasites from the alligator's mouth. We have birds that eat parasites on the back of wildebeest in Africa. We have fish that eat parasites off of fish on the coral reefs. So it benefits both species because one of them gets something to eat. The other one gets fewer parasites, right? This is sort of the famous, one of the famous examples, the clownfish and the sea anemone. And so the clownfish gets protection, right, because it can't get stung by the sea anemone, so it's safe in there. But does anybody know what the sea anemone gets out of this? I had to look this up actually once. I don't know what the sea anemone gets. So it turns out that when a sea anemone has a clownfish associated with it, it's swimming in between the tentacles. It creates currents of water that help waste circulate away and bring fresh, clean water in. So the sea anemones benefit that way. So anybody see the movie Finding Nemo? Yeah, you know, it's kind of a nice story, like what, small fish, big reef or whatever. He's got like such a photogenic smile, right? And then Dory, like she went off, did her own thing, made her own, she's kind of a big shot now, but she's got a little fin here. Well, it's really, I hope this doesn't disturb anybody. It's really important that you stay with your mutualist, because when you don't stay with your mutualist, things can go bad in a hurry when you're not near your mutualist anyway. So anyway, and I think this might have been his dad. He left the reef trying to help Nemo. Sorry about that. All right, so anyway, so that's mutualism. So then there's the one where like one species benefits and the other one is unharmed, unaffected, essentially. Which one is that? Yeah, so that's commensalism. This is the one that's discussed less. There are just fewer examples of it. So anybody know of an example of a commensalism one species benefits, the other one is unaffected?
A giraffe, like the birds.
Can you describe that one? I'm not familiar with that one.
I don't remember what the bird gets. The giraffe doesn't get anything out of it. It's the bird.
Okay, so the bird gets like something to eat.
The giraffe spots and essentially picks off unwanted creatures. But that's arguable because that could be considered helping the giraffe.
So if it's eating like parasites or something, I guess it'd be a mutualism, but maybe it's not. So it's getting something else.
So I don't know if the bird is that one. I don't know which.
That's cool. I need to look that one up. Yeah, well, cool. So you said the giraffe doesn't get anything out of it, but the bird does. So if that's the case, then yeah, that would be right up the commensalism alley. I want to look this up now. Giraffes are cool. You ever seen how giraffes run? They're crazy. And yeah, and they have to have all these crazy valves so that like when they like put their head down, they don't like pass out from all the blood rushing down to their head. They have all these valves in their blood vessels to keep all the head blood from rushing to their head, because if they did, they would pass out whenever they went down to drink. It's crazy being a giraffe. Crazy. Anybody else know any examples of commensalism?
There's the like shark and the little fish. Just like save the shark from
Yeah, there's the remoras, which like attach to them, and then those ones called pilot fish too, which so the shark seems unaffected, and I guess they feed on scraps, right? When the sharks feed, is my understanding. Cool. Is that what you were thinking of as well? Yeah. So a few examples of this. The example that I used is an epiphyte, so a plant that lives on top of another plant, a small one, okay? So epi just means on top of, so like the epidermis is like the layer on the top of your skin, right? So epiphyte just means it grows on top of a plant. So these plants in the tropics, so like lianas are an example of this, where they can live in the crook of a tree, and so they get the benefit of like water and nutrients collecting there, but so far as we know, the plant is unaffected, as long as there's not a ton of these, right? I mean, you can get vines that grow all over trees and pull them down, but not. So yeah, so commensalism, there's one benefit, and then one that's unaffected, and then the final one, of course, is parasitism, where one species benefits, the other is harmed, and lots of crazy examples of this. I'll just share one. So these are ants in the tropics that are parasitized by a nematode worm. It's this tiny little worm. And for a long time, myrmecologist, that's what you call someone who studies ants, myrmecologist. They thought that these were two different ant species. In fact, they're the same species, but this one has been parasitized by this nematode worm. And so all of the worm larvae are in its abdomen, and so it turns red and like kind of like stretches up. And then if you're a bird, what does this look like to you? A really weird ant. No. I mean, kind of like maybe a berry or something. But for whatever reason, so the birds come and they eat these ants then. And when they do that, the parasite then gets into the digestive tract of the bird, where it completes the next cycle of its life. And so then when the bird poops and it falls to the bottom of the forest, then the nematode finds its way back into the ant. And so it completes the life cycle this way. So it's interesting as a parasite, though, because you don't want to kill your host. Because if you kill your host, your life cycle gets stopped. So parasites feed off of their host, but their host has to stay alive in order to complete their life cycle, because all parasites almost all have to get from one host to another. Yeah, question?
There's like another one with the ant that's a parasite, and it like it lives in the ant for a little bit, but then it makes like the ant like kind of climb up the tree, and then it'll sprout through it, and then it'll release spores.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the name of that fungus? Oh man, it's on the tip of my tongue. Yeah. Not the fungus, but the name of the fungus. oh shoot, I can't remember. But anyway, yeah, these the crazy parasites actually like make a shift in the life cycle of their host, which are really interesting. Like they're, yeah, interesting things. So, right. So parasitism is different from predation because they don't generally, most cases, not always, kill their host, and they don't consume their entire host, right? Because they try to keep their host alive because they have to get to their next stop. Kind of like a commuter bus or something, I don't know. So consumption, entire consumption of one species by another is predation. And so, you know, predation is, of course, one of those really strong evolutionary forces. And it can lead to all kinds of adaptations in the predators and the prey. What are some examples of adaptations we see in prey in response to predation pressure? Yeah, so plants evolving thorns, that's a great example. Absolutely. So physiological, based on the physical shape, right, and behavioral. So of course, myself thinking about fish, we have puffer fish with all these spines, which make it hard to eat them. Also, many of them are toxic, as you may have heard. They eat them in Japan as a delicacy in the sushi market, but if you don't know how to cook it wrong, you're going to die. And there's also behavioral adaptations of fish schooling. And it's really interesting how fish respond. Why would a school be advantageous for a fish in response to predation? How's that a benefit? Say that again more.
The predator would think it's a larger thing. Yeah.
Exactly, right. So it creates a larger shape. So the predator, thinks that it's larger than it actually is. Absolutely. And it helps to detect predators because you've got hundreds of sets of eyes rather than just one. And confuses the predator as well. You might have seen these balls of fish kind of just like all swimming around, and so it's more confusing. So predation, all sorts of adaptations. And adaptation by the predator as well then, right? Because they evolved to be able to eat these things. So even though fishes school, billfishes like marlins and swordfish they've got these long beaks. And when they swim into these schools of fish, instead of picking out one to eat, they come in and kind of shake their head with that bill, and it's stunning back in the fish, and they kind of start falling to the bottom of the ocean, then they come in and eat them. So predators then evolve ways to deal with these adaptations as well. All right, so I want to talk a little more about competition. Everybody doing well? Do we need like a 1 minute stretch break or something? Let's take a 1 minute in place stretch break. Power down our brains slightly. You ever see that on the CPU of your computer? It shows the level of processing goes up and down. You can lower the processing rate in your brain for a while. Yeah, 75 minutes is a long time. Kind of is. Wonder what this thing is for. Anybody know what this is for?
If there's a couple buttons on it, you should poke it.
I'm looking right now. I'm looking. There's a red button that says "Do not touch, except in case of emergency." Should I press that one? Why don't you hold it and I'll press that button? No, there's actually no button on this at all. It's either a speaker or a microphone, I think. I can't figure out which one. Or it's a small model of the Giza pyramids. But probably not. Yeah, when we started, we tried out different microphones and we knew we were going to have to record our lectures. And like all these remote microphones were a lot worse than the lapel microphones, so they went and bought all the little remote lapel microphones, which is nice. As long as you turn them on. Otherwise, they don't work so well.
Tuition well spent, we don't know the tools, right?
What's that?
Tuition well spent, you guys don't know what tools you're using, right?
I know. Well, yeah, that was, so yeah, like we had to buy a bunch of these. There's like, they're all over campus. And then, yeah, all these microphones. And then, like if you teach in a classroom that doesn't have this, like one of the rooms I teach in doesn't have, so I have like this headset, but it's got like a cable that connects to USB, so I have to like carry it around with me. Like I'm like, you know, like those football coaches on the sidelines, like those, what's that?
You're your own leash at that point.
I am, and I haven't ripped it off the computer yet, but I probably will. But they couldn't do all those remote because they said if they did, like the feedback would be problematic or something. I don't know. I just believe everything those folks say because it took me too long to figure that out on my own. Speaking of figuring things out on your own, there's this person named Gauss who was interested in figuring out how competition worked. So he said to himself, let's do an experiment. So these are beakers. I spent way too much time making these slides in PowerPoint, by the way. I hope you appreciate them. But if you don't, that's okay too. So he had these beakers, and then he had, do you guys know what paramecium are? They're these tiny little, they're protozoans, and they're photosynthetic protozoans. So they're tiny little animals that are green and photosynthesize. And so he had 3 species of them: Paramecia caudatum, Paramecia aurelia, and Paramecia bursaria. And so first of all, he put this Paramecia caudatum in the beakers and followed them along. They were gray. They were not very interesting Paramecia. Well, they weren't. They had to be green to photosynthesize, but I made them gray so you could tell the difference. So when he did that, the populations grew to day 12, and then they kind of stayed the same from day 12 to 16. Why did the population stay the same from day 12 to day 16? Yeah, limited space, right? Did it hit the carrying capacity? No resources. So then he put Paramecia aurelia, who will be red in this particular illustration. And this is what happened. I mean, approximately. The numbers aren't exact. What happened? Yeah, exactly. Over time, aurelia dominated over caudatum. And so, what do you think the main resource is here? Them being photosynthetic paramecia. Light's the big one. They're in beakers. Yeah, we put the same amount of nutrients and all that stuff. Okay, all right. So he's like, all right, if you put 2 species together, eventually one's going to win out. Well, then he put Paramecia caudatum and Paramecia bursaria together. And this is what happened. What's going on here? Yeah, they coexisted. They both existed in equal abundance, but it was no coincidence that I put one on top and one on the bottom. In fact, one did very well at the top, the other one did very well at the bottom. Why might that have been the case? Any thoughts? Yeah, so it turns out, as you might imagine, like the ocean, right? There's more light at the top than at the bottom. Turns out that Paramecia caudatum does really well when there's lots of light, but Paramecia bursaria does well when there's not a whole lot of light. So neither one was able to dominate this whole space. They just used slightly different parts of what we might call the resource spectrum. So Gauss thought of it this way. He said, okay, there's this principle of competitive exclusion, first of all. And this is this idea that no 2 species can occupy the same niche indefinitely when resources are limiting? How many people pronounce that word niche? How many people pronounce that word some other way? You know, I go half and half, you know. Sometimes I'm niche, sometimes I'm niche, sometimes I don't know. I need to think of a new, yeah. So, I'll say niche today just because I want to be consistent. That's how I started. I'm going to stay with what I started with. All right. We'll define this term in just a second, but you can kind of get the idea, right? The niche is what the species needs to survive. And so, if two species are trying to survive in the exact same way, no two species can do that indefinitely when resources are limiting. What do you think of when you hear resources are limiting with regard to like Malthus and all that kind of stuff? You're like, I don't know. That was on the first exam. I've forgotten that already. I've taken that thumb drive out of my brain and have put in a new one. What was that? Yeah, survival of the fittest in the sense that, right, when there's not a whole lot left, we've got competition, point of crisis, one of those species that's the best fit to the environment is going to win out. However, the other thing that can happen when resources are limiting is that those species can partition the available resources, thereby reducing competition. So, right, that's what happened with our last example. So resource partitioning, then, is how species are able to coexist by using different locations along that resource spectrum, if you will. So if light is the main resource, one species does well in bright light, other species does well in low light. And so they each find that part of the resource, and then by doing that, they're able to coexist. And so they avoid dying off because if they're trying to use the same niche, the same resources indefinitely, then they're going to be in trouble. The other thing, I don't know, it's just worth keeping in mind this indefinitely part here too, because species can use the same niche for a little while. So it doesn't mean that we'll never ever see them do the same thing, but they can't do it indefinitely. All right, cool. So what is ecological niche? It's the role of an organism in an ecosystem. I had a professor who explained it to me this way, which I thought makes sense. It's what that organism needs to turn resources into offspring. So over its entire life cycle, all the things it needs, the temperature it needs, how much water it needs, the kind of nutrients it needs, the food it needs, what does it need to reproduce, what kind of habitat, all these sorts of things. So when you think of it, it's actually kind of unlikely that you would find species that completely overlap with their ecological niche. But if they do, one of them is going to win out eventually. All right, cool. So the role of a species in an ecosystem, the ecological niche. Now, are people still writing? Okay, all right, I'll keep going. I mean, it's okay. So some species play disproportionately large roles in the ecosystem. We have a term to describe this called keystone species. So this is any species that has a strong or wide-reaching impact out of proportion to its abundance. So a species that's not real abundant, but when you take it away, it has big impacts. And so one of the classic examples of this is in the marine kelp forests off the coast of California. So we have kelp, we have sea urchins, which eat the kelp, and we have sea otters, which eat the sea urchins. It's good that they eat sea urchins. Sea urchins, not a lot of things like to eat them. They're like spiny little like pin cushions that eat kelp, pretty much. Okay, but the sea otters eat them. Well, when you take away the sea otter, there's nothing to eat the sea urchin. So the sea urchins go crazy. Their population goes nuts. And of course, as their population grows, their ability to consume the kelp goes higher and higher. And then what happens is that the kelp die, they break down, and we have ecosystem failure. Kind of like we were building an arch and there's this stone in the middle and we take it out and the whole thing falls apart. That's bad. It's bad when it falls apart. Okay, so keystone species kind of helps hold our ecosystem together. Now, just looking at what we know about ecology so far, why might you expect that the population of sea otter would be relatively low compared to the sea urchins and compared to the kelp? Any thoughts? Is it high? Yeah,
So this is like one species and energy doesn't problem
Yeah, exactly. So it's toward the top of the food chain, and we know that we lose energy as we go up. So we'd expect that it would probably be less abundant. And then, yeah, it's also a mammal, so relatively speaking, it's more on the type 1 spectrum. All right, so here's a little example. It's a sea otter. Aren't they cute? Yeah, I mean, who doesn't have a stuffed sea otter at home? Yeah, see, we all do. I mean, we just have them around, because they're fun to have around, like all of our Cabbage Patch Kids. Sometimes they play together. It's a good time. And then the bald eagle, the symbol of our nation. Okay, so sea otters were hunted almost to extinction due to trapping in the 1800s, but then their populations grew quite a bit. Then unfortunately, again in the 90s, we're not quite sure why, their populations dropped once more. So these are data out near in the Aleutian Islands out in Alaska. So time when you had lots of sea otters and then very little. Okay, so here's our food web, our food chain, if you will. We've got otters consuming sea urchins, which consume kelp. Now, kelp is not just a food resource for sea urchins. How else might kelp benefit that ecosystem? Any thoughts?
Otters put a piece of kelp with the fat on their stomach when they're sleeping.
Otters put a piece of kelp on I did not know that. Well, we can add that to our list. So there's an important way. The otters.
Don't just
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, so that's important. And even when the kelp is intact as a forest, why might that be important to this ecosystem too? Say that again? So they're autotrophs, absolutely, yeah, providing a lot of energy, which moves up the food web. And yeah, and so if you go like snorkeling or scuba diving through here, you find lots and lots of fish. So it turned out that when that kelp forest was not there, there were a lot fewer fish. Again, it all comes back to the fish, at least with me. Also, some other things too, and you don't necessarily need to memorize this, but just realize like it had negative impacts all through the ecosystem. Lower fish, like imagine you've taken away a forest. Of course you're going to have fewer species living along that forest, right? All right, so then we've got all these fish species. I'm sorry, the only picture of this fish species I could find was on a plate, but anyway. So we've got all these fish species that hang out kind of in the kelp forest. So the bald eagles eat the fish. Okay, so how would we expect bald eagle populations to be affected by a decline to the sea otters populations? We can go step by step, right? So if this declines, what happens to this? It increases. If this increases, this decreases. Now, if there's less of this habitat around, less of that, and if there's less of that to eat, we might expect it to negatively impact our bald eagles too, like potentially, right? Okay. Bald eagle pictures, sorry. They're smiling. But it did not decline. Abundance of bald eagles did not decline. Any ideas why not? guys know that feeling when you don't know something and you're about to know it, and then, yes, you're probably tired of me saying that by now, but a lot of data here. Just want to make a couple points. So what they did was they looked at the diet of these bald eagles at the time when there were lots of sea otters and when there were very few sea otters. And they looked at mammals in the diet, birds in the diet, and fish. So they looked at the mammals, and it turns out they ate a fair amount of sea otters. In fact, when sea otters were present, 15% of bald eagle diet was sea otters. They love them. They also ate other things, like those Arctic foxes, you know, those cute, like, white foxes. They're like white when it's snowy, they're brown when it's not. Well, they eat those too. And so, like, almost a quarter of their diet were mammals when there were lots of sea otters around. When there weren't, it dropped down to 8%. All right, so let's look at the fish. So when there were sea otters around, fish were 36% of their diet. When sea otters weren't around, as we might expect, the amount of fish in their diet dropped to about a quarter. But if you look in more detail, some fish, abundance of them dropped. Other fish increased. So like they ate more mackerel. The mackerel didn't really care about the kelp forest. They're just like swimming around under the water. That's what mackerel do. But what about birds? About 40% of bald eagle diet was birds when there were otters around. When the otters weren't around, they switched. They started eating birds. 2/3 of their diet were birds. So the birds were kind of sad to see those sea otters go too. They're like, come back. Life is really difficult right now. These bald eagles won't leave us alone. All right. So we saw this change. So the authors argue that this is because of this switch in diet by the bald eagles. This is a 5 trophic level connection, and it's one of the only times they've ever seen that. That what affects this trophic level is connected by 4 different arrows to the next one. So the bald eagle was able to persist by switching its diet. So basically, by being more of a generalist, by being more of an omnivore, the bald eagle was able to survive. And if you're curious on how you get data on bald eagle diets, you get it by climbing up to the bald eagle nest and looking at the waist of the bald eagles. So this is a picture one of the authors took when they climbed up to this nest, and there was a bald eagle there, which didn't want this person poking around in the nest. So, you know, risky work, risky work. Cool. Have a good day. Any questions on what we did today? We got through a lot of stuff. Yeah?
Sorry, I missed that last part. Did you say that the bald eagles were omnivores?
Omnivores, right? Just meaning they were able to switch their diet. So, yeah, thanks. And so really the point I was making is that when we look at these connections in the food web, sometimes sometimes we forget that there's flexibility in there. And some species are more flexible than others. But, you know, these connections were pretty tight. That's pretty tight. But then here, it just simply switched what it was eating. Yeah. So, anyway, just an example of kind of how, like, losing one species over here affected a species way over here, like 4 trophic levels away. So, cool. All right, awesome. We'll have a great couple days, and I'll look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, and I should have your exams graded by then.